This podcast is brought to you thanks to the generous support of Whistler Blackcomb, leaders in delivering adventure.
I'm always amazed at what actually doesn't happen to people. I mean, how many times you look at somebody doing something and you think, oh, look at that, that's crazy. Or, oh boy, I wouldn't climb up that slope today. And 9 times out of 10, nothing happens. That always strikes me like people get away with more than they probably should. And also that's non-event feedback. So people are overconfident. Just because you got away with it doesn't mean it was a good decision.
Welcome to Delivering Adventure. This is the podcast that explores what it really takes to share adventure like a pro, with your friends, your family, and as a profession. My name is Chris Capio, and I'm coming to you from Whistler, British Columbia.
And I'm Jordy Shepherd, recording from Canmore, Alberta. After a lifetime of working extensively in different parts of the adventure guiding industry, Chris and I have teamed up to launch this podcast. In each episode, you will hear top adventure guides, managers, marketers, and athletes share their best stories, advice, and trade secrets. The goal of this podcast is to share how you can take yourself and others farther from the mountains to the office and beyond. Welcome back to our exploration of risk and adventure with Grant Statham. In our last episode, Grant helped us to better understand risk and its core elements. In this episode, we are going to take this conversation further by exploring some of the strategies that we can use when we are leading adventures. If you missed the last episode, Grant Statham is an ACMG, IFMGA mountain guide. Grant currently works for Parks Canada as a visitor safety specialist, where he's involved in mountain rescue and avalanche forecasting. Grant also works as a risk consultant and speaker.
We have a lot to talk about in this episode, so we're going to get straight to it. Like all of our episodes, we will be doing a recap of the key takeaways at the end, so you can sit back and relax. Okay, let's bring Grant back into the DA studio.
Well, we're welcoming back Grant Statham here, back to the Delivering Adventure studio. And Grant, we'll start with there was one event that was a big catalyst for a lot of us in the rescue world, in the risk management world in Canada. And that was the Connaught Creek accident, an avalanche accident, February 1st, 2003 at Glacier National Park, the Glacier National Park in Canada at Rogers Pass in British Columbia. And we've got yourself, Grant, myself here and in the studio, along with Chris, our co-host, and you and I both are very connected to that incident kind of in slightly different ways. So I'll just paint a picture of what happened there. There was a large group ski touring in Connaught Creek behind what used to be where the hotel was at Rogers Pass in Glacier National Park, and a large avalanche. They were all involved in a large avalanche. It was a group of 14 students, grade 10 school students from a private school in Calgary, and 3 adult chaperone teachers that were involved. And I came in as the rescue branch director there, working for Parks Canada. And then Grant, you came in subsequent to that as a risk specialist for Parks Canada. So maybe we'll just talk about how did you come to the decision to work for Parks Canada there, and also how is all of that shaped you in how you personally, professionally manage risk and understand risk?
Well, that was a turning point for so many people. Tragically for many, and like professionally for me, it was a huge turning point. I'd always wanted to work for Parks Canada ever since I was 17 years old. I used to see the rescue people in their orange jackets skiing around and think that is cool. I got to do that, but just wasn't in the cards for me. So I pursued this guiding career, and took it a fair ways. I feel like I did what I wanted to do with it, actually. And then 2003, that avalanche happened that you spoke about, Jordy, and that was just a catastrophe. And, it happened also, I should say, 10 days after another catastrophe had just happened and killed 7 adult ski tourers nearby. And so, working in the industry at that time, we were reeling a little bit, especially after I heard that grade 10 kids had been killed in an avalanche in Rogers Pass. It just was like, oh, I don't even know what this means. I just know it means a lot, and it's going to be big and everything's going to change, but I have no idea what that means. And I just continued about my guiding business, to be honest with you. I didn't pay much attention to policy or government or anything like that at the time. Then actually that summer, so that would be summer of 2003, I had a 5-year-old, and I was, earning money for the family. I was the worker in the house, and I burnt my hand badly in a sort of a white gas accident right at the start of the summer. And I ended up having to sort of give up all my summer guiding work and therefore income. And now I can tell you that that's vulnerability. I realized, wow, I'm in a really vulnerable position here. I have no backup. I got to provide income for my family, and now I've just with a simple accident with a stove, and I can't work all summer. So, boy, I got to think about doing something else. And right then, coincidentally, I received an opportunity to apply for a job with Parks Canada. They were looking to hire somebody to implement recommendations coming from a review. So, that's what governments do after a big catastrophe. They have a review and they bring in experts to look at the situation and make recommendations about how it could be different. And that had been done, and Parks Canada had a report with 36 recommendations in it, and I was hired to implement those recommendations. So that's kind of how I got started. It was a big shift. It definitely was not how I ever expected to be working for Parks Canada as a policy guy. I thought to myself, well, this is an opportunity to get in the door, to be honest with you. I'm going to take it. I'm going to try and get this job, even though it's not quite what I wanted to do, but let's see where it goes. And it turned out to be probably the best career move of my life. That's for sure. And when I started, it was really intimidating, working into a government office, working in the bureaucracy with a background like mine. I was as green as it could be. And someone handed me a box of business cards on my first day. Here you go. They're getting me set up with my desk. They're signing me up at Human Resources. And they handed me a box of business cards that someone had made. And I looked at it, and my title was Avalanche Risk Specialist. And that's quite serendipitous, really, when I think about it now, because I remember looking at it and thinking, Avalanche Risk Specialist. I wonder what that means. I better figure out what that means, because that's apparently on my business card. And I'm not kidding. That's actually kind of how I started, was looking up risk. Like, I better figure out what it means. And I started to learn about risk, and I'm working on risk management programs at this time. And the more I learned about risk and formally learned about risk and reading papers and reading research and reading books, talking to experts, I realized that everything I had been doing for the past 15 to 20 years fit perfectly into risk management frameworks. And yet I had never been taught any of that stuff. And we were not teaching that in guides training. We weren't teaching that in avalanche forecasting. Why aren't we doing this? Because this is the structure. And I found it was so exciting, to be honest with you, because I found a way to explain the decision-making behind all these different scenarios I'd encountered in my life. And so that's really how my journey down the risk rabbit hole started. And I have found since that time, many, many, many people have gone down the same rabbit hole, because when you've spent a lot of time managing risk and taking risk, and suddenly you find a framework that explains it, it is kind of addictive, to be honest with you. It's exciting to be able to explain things that seemed almost impossible to explain without that.
And so how did this develop your own approach to managing and understanding risk?
Well, like I said, it didn't necessarily change how I actually act. My actions didn't change much, because, like I say, I think I say I, but we as a group of professionals had been doing it really well. Like, we were managing exposure, we were estimating probabilities, we were doing all that. We just never spoke of it that way. But now I had a language to explain it, and I could explain it to people outside of my small mountain world, because now I was talking to parents of school kids in Calgary who don't know much about mountains like we do. I would be speaking to politicians. I was speaking to engineers and other professionals. I was encountering academics, and now I had a language to explain what we did in the mountains, and it was unbelievably powerful. one of the things that we did is we developed something called the avalanche terrain exposure scale, which is it's well established now, but it's a system that ranks different kinds of mountain trips according to their exposure to avalanche terrain. So basically, from class 0 means there's no exposure to avalanche terrain, and class 4 is extreme terrain. That's the big stuff, and everything in between. But that was something that we've been doing for years. As let's just say, as a heli ski guide, for example, I've been working on run lists, and every day with my team, we've been making things green, yellow, and red, and we've been assessing the terrain. And so I was able to take that, frame it up in a risk framework, because that's exposure. That's the management of exposure, and it fits into the risk framework. And now we have this system that's called the terrain exposure scale, and it's used internationally. But again, it fits cleanly inside a risk framework. So that's one example of how the concept of risk has informed the design of risk management systems.
And then for yourself, you're going out to do a personal day, a guiding day, or a response as a rescue professional. Interweave that a bit for us into how those frameworks are actually applied by you on the ground when you got your boots on.
Well, probably the biggest one was it was through that process when I really became aware of the importance of managing someone else's risk tolerance. And, prior to that, I would hear conversations amongst myself and my friends and other guides where we'd say things like, oh, well, you can't do that when you're guiding, but you can do that on your day off. That's a commonly said thing. But what that actually means is when you're managing someone else's risk, their tolerance is lower. So you got to bring it down a little bit while you're working. But on your day off, you're managing your own risk, so you can lift it up. I spent a lot of time studying risk and kids and the legal implications of risk and kids, because that was part of the work to do with what we called custodial groups. That was a new term at the time, but minors in the backcountry. And through that study, I realized, oh, wow, okay, it's different when you're guiding kids. They even call children the, quote, vulnerable sector. If you go to the RCMP, you want to be a coach of a soccer team, you got to go to the RCMP in Canada here, and they'll do a check with the vulnerable sector to make sure you can work with children. So I guess, practically speaking, day to day, I really learned to adjust my risk for different people. And even though I maybe was doing that before, I think I became very aware of it through that process, and knowing how important it is to understand someone else's risk tolerance and manage for them, not necessarily for me.
And so what's going through your head when let's say you're out ice climbing and you're not there yet. You're not at the ice climb yet, but you're planning it. You and a partner, we'll assume you're not soloing here, are heading out.
Good assumption.
That's probably a good assumption. Which does happen too. Like, that's a different approach to risk as well. But so you and a partner,
a different podcast.
You and your partner are planning on going out to do Ice Climb X. Kind of what's your process there that you go through in terms of risk and understanding risk and everything from, let's say checking conditions to equipment to emergency preparedness to discussions that you have?
Well, the first thing would be the partner and who it is. Who am I going with? So let's just say I'm going with a friend of equal skill and experience with me. So I want to know that. And I don't really like going climbing with people who I don't like climbing with, I guess, to just be blunt. I like climbing with people that I get along with. We have fun. And there's nothing worse than being out with somebody who has a different risk tolerance than you. I mean, we've all probably been there. Everybody in the world has been in some scenario where their partner or friend is just doing something that's just, they don't like it. And boy, I hate that in the mountains. So I don't like being with people who are going to do that. So the partner is very important. Then the actual climb, of course, I guess if we're planning it, then I feel it's something that's within my abilities. So now it's about the conditions. And, so if it's an ice climb, I want to know, first of all, like there really is a 4-step process to managing risk. And the first step is identification of the risk. So I'm going to be looking at that climb closely to see what the different hazards are. Has it got a big avalanche slope above it? Does it face south? And is it going to be a warm day, so the ice is going to melt? I want to understand all the things that could go wrong. And then I'm going to make a decision on the day. Is this the right day for it or not? And I think this is where a lot of people make a mistake, is on that part, especially people who come to visit. I have the luxury of living here. So if it's not the right day, I'll just go do something else, come back on the right day. And I think that's really important concept for people, especially when we get someone who's traveled a long way, they've planned this trip, they're super invested in it, and it's not the right day to climb that route. Sometimes it's hard for people to change their mind, but I make sure I got the right day. And I will say that I don't mess around with like tormenting myself about the danger either. Like, if I'm going to climb in avalanche terrain and the avalanche danger is considerable, which is level 3 out of 5, I mean, that's just oftentimes too much for me, depending on where it is. I generally don't like to really expose myself to avalanche danger unless the conditions are pretty good. So I'll just do something else. So I do an assessment of the hazard, now remember, hazard doesn't include me. So I'm sitting in my living room and I'm looking at the conditions and trying to decide how much I'm willing to expose myself. So when the danger is lower, like it is right now outside, then I'm more willing. Okay, now's a good time. Let's expose ourselves. So let's talk about how we're going to do this route. Let's talk about the approach. Let's just go through the whole thing, and I'll just go through it with my partner, make sure we're on the same page. I do like to identify the crux or crucial decision points ahead of time, because if you know the decision points ahead of time, you can prepare for them while you're actually moving through the terrain. So on the approach, I'm looking at different stuff, kind of getting ready, because I know I got to make a choice pretty soon. And again, I like to wait till the last minute, but I'm getting ready to make that decision. So that's really how I approach it. Always ready to turn around and change. And then with regards to being prepped with, rescue gear and emergency equipment, again, that goes to vulnerability again. It depends where we're going. And sometimes I don't take a shovel. Most of the time I do. But these are conversations you got to have with your partner ahead of time. I always have some kind of emergency communication device. I always have a first aid kit, and I always have some extra warm clothing. I have a knife in my pocket every time I climb anything. Always, because there's lots of ropes that get tight, so you want to be able to cut. So there's a few basic things like that. So that's kind of my planning process ahead of time. It doesn't necessarily follow a formula, but it involves a lot of research ahead of time and understanding the terrain and making sure I communicate well with my partner and that we've got all the right equipment.
Yeah, and then it sounds like you set yourself up and your partner up with the ability to change the plan. If at some point, whether it's in the pre-planning phase, talking about the route, you decide, okay, we're going to go do something else, or you're on the approach and you decide, okay, no, this is not working because we're wading through way steep snow that we didn't expect, or the winds aloft are really, really, really cooking and we didn't expect to see that, or there's an inversion and which is really hard sometimes to tell, right? That things have changed when we're talking big elevation differences.
Another, I think you can always get out. That's the thing that sometimes is missed by public perception. What are you doing out there today? It's crazy. It's raining. You shouldn't be out there. Well, the truth is you can go out any day you want. You just have to manage your exposure. And so even if conditions are terrible, that doesn't mean you can't go to the ski hill and ski on groomed runs, or, you can always do something. It may not, be pleasant or comfortable, but in terms of risk, because we're in charge of our exposure, we can always get out. And I sometimes think that is an important concept. Public perception. If there's an avalanche and it's in the news, people are often very critical. What are you doing out there today? And but the thing is you can get out there every day. What we do is manage exposure. So you just have to be able to turn it up and turn it down to be able to manage the risk properly.
Yeah, and one way I find I deal with that professionally and personally is I have lists, and that's a really nice thing to go to when you're kind of like uncertain about what what do we want to do instead of that route or instead of that trip, either with clients or without clients, just personally. And so if you have lists, and guidebooks are lists too, then you can go look at that, right? And it really, you often surprise yourself. You think, okay, well, I know every route in that guidebook, but when you actually pull the guidebook out, you're like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. That actually would be a good option right now. And so I keep lists on my phone where on a given day, whether I'm guiding or doing personal stuff, I can choose something that's appropriate in terms of exposure and the level of difficulty and the conditions that we have. But you don't have to rack your brain, because we all know our brains are very powerful and we don't use them anywhere near to their capacity. So therefore, I use the crutch of lists.
Yeah, that goes back to you mentioned options earlier. So you always having a few different options. And what you're describing there reminds me, again, back to our development of that avalanche terrain exposure scale. That's what that did for a lot of people, is it basically made a list and it categorized them. So if maybe you wanted to ski something that was a complex piece of terrain, but today's not the day, much like you just described, you can pull out the list and go, oh, I need to go to some class 1 terrain today. What are my choices? So I think that's a really important point you bring up, is options and actually having available lists, because they don't readily come to mind when you need them if you don't have them written down somewhere.
No, and then erring on the side of caution too is usually a good idea. Where it's like, if there's something on your list, it's like, well, maybe that's okay. To me, that's not good enough. It has to be with some pretty clear certainty in terms of, say, avalanche danger or the condition of the ice, or crevasses being covered or not, or serac fall hazard or rock fall hazard, all that kind of stuff. It has to be like, okay, I'm sort of thinking that's probably okay, and maybe I'll go have a look to see. But if I want to have better clarity on it, I'm probably going to choose the options that have a higher level of successful outcome.
When I look at that kind of stuff, because so many decisions that we make, especially when we're in the middle of an adventure, they're subjective, they're intuitive, and you hear people say all the time, "Oh, I got this feeling." They make decisions based on feelings, and I believe in that. I do it myself, but I do have a little bit of a principle around that, is that decisions that I make that are based on feelings are decisions to retreat or to reduce my risk. So that's happened to me. I bet it's happened to you guys. All of us professionals have so many stories where we had some weird feeling. We just had a feeling something wasn't right. Couldn't really put your finger on it, but that's a good time to reduce your risk and get out.
But you're not using that to move forward and carry on.
Exactly.
With the trip. Yeah.
Yes. I don't say, oh, I've got a good feeling, I'm going to really, jack my risk here. That one needs evidence. So this is my 2 ways. I can reduce my risk based on feelings and feel good about that, but I will not take more risk unless I have real evidence to support that. So that's sort of factual stuff. And I can actually, when I'm out with people, examining people, I ask them specifically, why are you doing that? And I really want to hear clear answers. If you can't give me a clear answer why you're going to take a risk and explain it really well, you're out.
That intuition piece, it is interesting how our brains are always working and collecting information. How many times have you had it where you can't remember somebody's name and you're like, oh God, I can't believe I can't remember that person's name. And then hours later, you're doing something completely different and boom, there it comes to you, because your brain has been working on solving that problem the whole time. And I think that that's often what happens when we're out in these situations. We might be focused on doing our activity, but our brain is collecting that information around us the whole time. And it might not be obvious to us why we're making that decision to not do something, or get that, like, as you said, that feeling of, well, I don't know, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe this should be the last run of the day, and your brain has actually picked up on the point that your performance is starting to drop because you're starting to get tired. But I think if you don't have that experience and that awareness, that can often be missed. Grant, in your profession, throughout your career, what are some other common mistakes that people can make when it comes to managing risk when they're out there doing these adventures?
Here's a common mistake people make. And, Jordy will know this one, being a search and rescue guy also. People split up. It seems like, I don't know how many people I've rescued where there was a party of 2 or 3 and then they split up. And then that's, one thing's led to another. And next thing you know, they're getting rescued and they tell this story about how they split up. Seems to be a really common thing. And from a risk point of view, just think about what that does. It increases your vulnerability. Suddenly you're with, you're with a group of people. So you kind of got some group support. Now you're alone while your vulnerability changes. So I think that's a common mistake when things are going sideways. Don't split up, or have some pretty good rationale for that.
And if you are splitting up, have communications. So splitting up without communications, really now you go from known, you're all together and you're all, having a bad time, or you're all okay, or, whatever's going on. Now you split up and now nobody knows what the other person is doing. And somebody gets out to a trailhead, but the people that are still in the backcountry don't know that somebody got out to the trailhead. And sometimes you do have to do that. But if you can have communications, well, then you actually can all stay together and hopefully just call out and let someone in the outside world know what your issue is, and then get some advice and some other perspective on it that you may not have. But if you don't have communications, really be careful about splitting up like that. Because now, as soon as you're 1 minute down the trail away from your friends, what if you trip and fall and hit your head? They don't, and human nature is just to go to that worse and worse. Like, well, maybe a bear got them. Maybe, they haven't been back in hours. I'm getting colder. It's just a really, really difficult thing. But if you had even, maybe the range and FRS radios, just the basic radios, you could at least say, yeah, I'm okay still. And, I've talked to somebody else on the trail, or, that sort of thing, right? Communications is a huge piece in there.
It's key.
I'm going to add kind of one thing to this. From my experience, I've had it a number of times where people have disappeared on me for different reasons. Sometimes they wanted to disappear and get your attention, and other times they just forgot what you said or maybe didn't pay attention. But in all cases, I find it's really helpful if you're splitting up to make sure everybody knows what the plan is. So where are we going to meet next? If this doesn't work or something happens, where is that relocation position going to be? Like, where are we going to meet? What happens if this doesn't work out this way? So if we go down this run and we don't meet here, where is the next place that you're going to meet? Or if you're going to split up on this trail, where is that spot? And thinking ahead in those terms, as opposed to sometimes I think a mistake that people can make is just thinking that of course it's gonna work out. Like, why wouldn't it?
Yeah, we just did a evac in the backcountry with my SAR team, and so as we flew out of the backcountry with an injured subject, the other person was already hiking out, their partner, and down to the trailhead. So we actually stopped, landed the helicopter, got out, and put a note on the windscreen of on the windshield of that partner's car, because nobody's in cell range in the backcountry, so that they would know that, okay, this person has actually been flown out by helicopter, and we're going to meet at, and of course it was Tim Hortons. You will meet them at Tim Hortons.
A common Canadian meetup.
Yeah, exactly. For our international clients, international visitors. Yeah, that's commonly where things happen. And so, but at least everybody knew, right? Because then we're picturing, we fly out with this person, the other person's already hiking out, doesn't know that their partner has flown out, and they get to the trailhead, and then they're waiting for them maybe to come down, or they don't know if they should go out into cell range or not. And yeah, and so I was picturing, if we don't do this, we're going to be back there that night looking for the partner who doesn't know what to do, and maybe something happened to them.
When people go missing, it's very difficult to be able to anticipate what is actually going through their mind and what their situation is like, and that goes both ways for sure. Grant, do you have any other examples of common mistakes that people make?
Well, I think overconfidence is a really big one. People often overestimate how much they think they know about the situation, when in a lot of times we don't actually know very much. I always like the quote about expert opinion, often wrong, but rarely in doubt. And I think it's true for a lot of people. It's we think we know more than we do. And sometimes we need to just recognize the uncertainty in what we're actually doing, that we actually don't know that much. We're doing the best we can. So much of what we do is a process of eliminating uncertainty. Like, I can reduce my risk with knowledge, but there's just some kind of knowledge that we can't know. And so I think our job is to do the best we can to gather as much knowledge as we can. But at the same time, we have to really recognize when we don't know things. And I'm always amazed at what actually doesn't happen to people. I mean, how many times you look at somebody doing something and you think, oh, look at that, that's crazy. Or, oh boy, I wouldn't climb up that slope today. And, 9 times out of 10, nothing happens. And so that always strikes me, like the people get away with more than they probably should. And also that's non-event feedback. So people are overconfident. Just because you got away with it doesn't mean it was a good decision at all. So I think overconfidence is a big one that people make. And so having some humility and recognition of how much you don't know is a really important part of managing risk in an uncertain environment.
We're going to pause here for a moment so that we can ask you, our listener, an important question. Are you enjoying this episode so far? If you are, then please take a moment to follow the show in your favorite podcast app or service. Jordy and I have a lot of great content coming your way, including more episodes on how to manage risk and avoid misadventure, what to do in the moment of crisis, how to manage conflict and adventure, how to coach people through fear, how to make better decisions. We have case studies, and the list just goes on. When you follow the podcast, you don't have to worry about losing the show because new episodes will come directly to you when they are released. If you've already followed the show, Jordy and I would like to thank you very much for your support. You're awesome. Now, back to our interview with Grant Statham.
I think it's really important for all of us to remember that a good outcome and a good decision are not always the same thing.
Completely. I mean, I work with a guy, Steve Halatzi, who is just really big on process, and decision quality is sort of the area of interest that he speaks about quite a bit. And really, his emphasis is to focus less on outcome and more on the process of the decision. So you might have an accident. That happens to us. We talked about that on the last episode. We go out and do things, and there's always risk. So we can't necessarily eliminate the risk. But we can do our best to have a solid process for making decisions. And even if we have a bad outcome, we can take some comfort in knowing that we did everything we could to follow a solid methodological process to actually get there. And so decision quality and process is important.
What kind of mistakes do you think people tend to make around managing groups?
Well, probably first is the idea of we're going to take people out and increase their risk. Just that concept. I mean, we do that. But as a concept, I think it's important to understand, I mean, we've talked about this already, what those people want. And so, just because you think it's great to go to you don't necessarily have to go to these kind of places with people to give them a fantastic day. A lot of times, as an adventure leader, you can go somewhere that you might have been over and over. You might know it really well. It might be maybe a little mellow. Your people are going to love it. You might find it a little bit boring, maybe, but they might love it. And so I think it's important right up front in terms of exposure to make sure that you're pretty clear on what's going to make your clients really pleased for that day, what your group's going to like. Because it doesn't mean you necessarily have to jack the risk just to give somebody a great day. Sometimes that's part of a consequence of it, but I think that's an important part.
Yeah, when I'm guiding, I want to actually have low stress guiding. I don't want to be amped up and worried the entire day. That's just not a good place to operate. So yeah, being a little bit more on the boring side for you as a guide is not a bad place to be. And the people that you're with are often having an exceptional time.
I've always found there's two, when I'm guiding, I look at it as trying to understand how to do things in two different ways. First of all, there's you need to get good at going back to the same place over and over and over again. And that has its benefits. You might find it boring, but boy, you get like Mount Athabasca, for example. I haven't been there for a long time, but I used to climb it a lot. And that meant I knew every corner, every crevasse, everything. It was great. And boy, you learn a lot about terrain and managing people when you go to the same place over and over, because you learn the patterns of that mountain. You see the different slopes that face in different directions under all the different conditions. And that's an essential skill in being an outdoor leader. But I would contrast that with another essential skill, which is being able to go somewhere brand new for the first time, and be able to make assessments and to be able to take the terrain in for the first time and essentially on-site things. It's a totally different skill set, but they both play off each other in terms of how you guide groups. And I think a really well-rounded outdoor leader is going to be good at both of those. And over time, the experience you get from doing both those things, getting micro on the trip, so everything about it, and then being macro and understanding how to actually handle terrain that you've never been in before. You blend those two things together, you're really going to make yourself well-rounded and experienced if you sort of pursue it, looking at it in two different ways.
So in your TED Talk, which I recommend everybody watch, your TED Talk on managing risk and understanding it, one of the terms that you examine is the margin of error. And can you explain to our listeners what that is and why that is so important to be able to understand that and to implement that?
Well, there's always a failure point in a risk decision, where loss can happen. So there's I would just call it the line. When you've crossed the line and then you have an accident, or maybe you lost a whole bunch of money, or maybe you lost your relationship, something happened where you crossed the line. So a margin is your distance from that line. And so we want to keep some distance from that line. I don't think our objective is to be right up against the edge of the risk line where we're right on the edge. No, we want to keep some distance from that. But knowing where that line is and how much distance we need is the challenge. To give you an example of when it's less of a challenge, I'll use engineering risk as an example. Let's talk about a carabiner. I think probably a lot of people watching the show know about carabiners. They all come with a braking strength. They've been tested. So the way that works is their materials testing determines where the carabiner will fail, and then they might add a 0 to that and design it to that. So they'll add a 10 times margin of safety, if you're following me here. But in order to be able to do that, and engineering does that all the time, they'll figure out where something fails, then they'll add a couple zeros to the math to give it a big margin. So they're not even close to the breaking point. But in order to do that, you need to know where the breaking point is. And in a lot of the risks that we deal with in the outdoors, we don't actually know where it is. We only know it when we've crossed it. I think of it as an invisible risk. So therefore, I think just having that concept of margin is important. And how I really came to really understand margin was when I crossed it once, snowcat skiing, and almost got my son caught in a large avalanche. He was fine. He wasn't involved, but I had a client that broke their leg, and I had somebody I had to search for. And in the end, other than the broken leg, we all got away from it okay. But, I got too close. I knew it. Again, it's back to the human thing. I knew I probably shouldn't be in here, but I figured I could manage the situation. I took my group too close to the edge, and we had an accident. And, my reflection on that was deep because my son was nearby. He was 11 at the time. So I had a lot of reflection about that. And I just realized I can't get that close. I got to find a way to recognize when I'm too close to the edge and then back it off and keep that important margin there. I think it's a real fundamental risk management concept.
Just to jump back, partly to do with that, Grant, but to jump back to the whole group management idea, what do you feel are the differences between having one person involved in an incident and more than one person in terms of group management and exposure? And then the bad thing happens, let's call it an avalanche, let's call it a rockfall event, whatever, and you have more than one person. Is it an exponential change for how much worse it is? Is it, what are the complexities that you feel that are added on to by having more than one person involved?
Well, it's definitely more complex. It probably is exponential. Just like people who have kids. I only ever had one kid, and everybody told me when you had two, it's like having way more. So it's probably the same with groups in an accident, I suspect. if you have one person who's had a wreck, it's somewhat manageable. But when you've got two people and they're spread out, it's way more complicated. Certainly when we're responding to a rescue, it's more complicated. If there's a party over here and another one over here, well, now we have two rescues to do instead of one. I think that when people are considering their risk with respect to groups, people always want to know, let's use the example of walking along a trail underneath a large avalanche path. Should we space out? Should we go one at a time? Or should we all race across it as one group? And so that's a classic exposure question. It's sort of almost a textbook avalanche risk exposure question. How do you do it? I don't have an answer because every situation is different. But the things to consider there are that if you go one at a time, then of course you've reduced your risk by exposure in space because there's only one person at a time in the slope. But you've just increased it in time because now it's going to take you an hour to get across this thing where you could maybe walk across it in 15 minutes grouped up. So I think those are the things people have to ask themselves. It doesn't necessarily make sense to go one at a time always. Sometimes it makes sense to just group up and get through the situation and you're fast and it's over. And avoiding having multiple people caught in anything. I mean, we want to avoid anything, but certainly if you do get multiple people caught in stuff, then that's a bigger deal. So let's just say you're skiing through starting zones. It's often pretty easy to just go one at a time through a short little spot if you need to.
Well, and so it's this addition factor, right? So you have more than one person involved. That's obviously not a good thing. There's the complications around all that, communications and being maybe spread out and just having more to deal with. But there's also a deletion, a subtraction factor there, where you have taken one of your able-bodied people by having two people involved instead of one in an incident. You now have one less person to help respond to the incident on site too. And that's a huge factor, having less people responding to more people that are having the issue. It's a really, really big change. It's probably even possibly more than exponential, the difference.
So everything we talked about today really sort of demonstrates how hard it can be to make the right risk calculations because there's a lot of information that we might not know. It's hard for us to calculate the likelihood of things happening. Our own judgment can be clouded. I was tasked with trying to come up with a training program to reduce injuries with ski and snowboard instructors, as I mentioned in the last episode. And I ended up designing 7 videos to act as a training guide for the instructors. And it basically got down to 7 hours with a video because it is so complicated. There are so many little things, intricacies, biases that we can suffer from, things that we can use. And that is just one activity, skiing and snowboarding. But what I did find is that it does come back to one simple thing that we can do that can make a really big difference. And this comes out of what you were just saying with the margin of error. And that is asking ourselves, do you need to do this? So whatever it is you think you want to do, ask yourself, do you need to do it? And if the answer is, well, actually, I don't really need to do it, then you just don't do it. But if you determine that you do need to do it, then ask yourself, okay, well, what can I do to give myself the best chance of success? What can I do to give myself that biggest margin of error possible? Because if something goes wrong, I'm going to be the one to hold myself the most accountable. So if I get injured and I'm sitting on the couch, I'm going to be replaying that, just like the situation that you were shared earlier with the snowcat, where you're thinking, wow, I shouldn't have done that, or if I did it, I should have done it this way, and you have that regret. And so I think if we can all go into situations like that by thinking, okay, listen, if this goes sideways, at least I did this and this and this and this and this, and I did everything I could in my power to give myself the best chance of success. And that could be going slower, it could be taking more time to prepare, it could be making sure you're more focused, all of those sorts of things.
That would be being less focused on the outcome and more focused on the process of getting there.
Yeah, exactly. I ended up going out with a kids group, so they're teens around 14. It was a high-end ski group, and they went. The goal for the morning was to ski a very narrow chute, which is beyond my risk tolerance, quite frankly. So I've never done it. Um, it doesn't matter the run. I'll just describe it as very difficult, like triple black terrain. But I watched the process that the instructor used to prep the group, and he'd actually been working with the group for the entire season. It was March, and even that day, he was exposing the kids to similar situation where he could to prepare the kids for that moment, and even right up until the moment where he decided to send the kids down, he was making that evaluation of, okay, what am I looking for here? Well, I'm looking for these kids to be able to go down this straight chute without any hesitation. They can't even want to check their speed because there is no escape route. They have to straight line, through this section to make it out to the bottom. And he wasn't committed to that decision right up until the moment that he sent each kid through, and they all made it with flying colors, actually, because he built up such a big margin of error. But I think a lot of people, like you said, Grant, push themselves right up to that edge.
Well, that's as you describe that sounds to me like an example of really good decision making and like a process to get there. Recognizing that by keeping our minds open and being ready to change our minds, but still stepping forward and continuing towards our objective, it puts more pressure on ourselves because, now that person could find themselves right at the top of that chute. I mean, they're there and they may change their mind, that's a hard place to change your mind. So I think the right way to approach it is exactly as you described it there, being flexible, being open, preparing people, continuing to move forward, but always with the mind that there could be a plan B or there could be an out. But to do that, you just have to recognize that as you bring yourself closer and closer to your objective, those bias and human factors are going to really start pushing on you because there's just more and more pressure for you to deliver. Because if you get to the top of the chute and you have to tell those people, well, sorry, we've been working up for it all day, but we're not doing it now. Totally reasonable to be able to do that, but recognize that's a harder decision to make than if you make that an hour and a half earlier.
Yeah, I'll just add one piece. There's a fellow we'll give the link on YouTube here. His name's Gordon Graham, and he's got a short video on risk, and it's about high risk, low frequency events. And, so things that don't happen very often, but when they do, they're kind of like a big deal and quite risky and not a lot of known information. And one thing is definitely worth a listen. We'll put a link in the show notes there to it. And he's quite funny too, which is great. And he has this piece about whether you're making a decision in a risk situation, whether you have discretionary time or you don't have discretionary time. And so sometimes we have to make quick split second decisions in the emergency world or when things are going poorly. But if you have some time in an emergency kind of situation or in your decision making at all, then take the time. And that's what I find a lot of people don't do enough of, is when things are starting to ramp up and they're feeling the pressure and, the group is like, oh, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? And you're feeling pressured like that. Actually go the opposite direction and take a little bit of time. And that will, we're talking about process and planning. It sort of just levels the playing field there and takes that time pressure out. Of course, you don't want to be doing that when you're right under the serac and it's starting to crack and you're like, well, maybe it's time to move quickly at that point. But if you have discretionary time, use it to your advantage in your decision making and in your understanding of risk and your approach to risk.
Well, to follow up on that, Jordy, I was training a group of supervisors and managers in the snow school last week on how to work with their staff, teaching risk management and a little bit of decision making. And I put a picture up of a tree run. So it's a graded tree run. It's difficult terrain for most people. And I said, well, what kinds of things here would make you more vulnerable, increase your vulnerability, and make it more difficult for you to be able to plot your next turn? Like what is going to influence you when you're thinking, wow, where should I go next? And, people are saying, well, your ability, which is true. And, the type of snow, the visibility, whether you're fatigued. And I said, well, how about the speed? The faster you go down this run that I'm showing you right here, the harder it's going to be for you to decide whether you should or shouldn't go here or there. And if we can just slow things down, often it just gives us a chance to process those human factors that you just touched on, Grant, and buys us time to find that best option, because that's really what decision making is, isn't it? It's deciding on option C is the best option here. But if you haven't seen option C, because you can only see A and B because you don't have any time to look for option C, then you've really limited yourself.
I really like this topic. It's interesting we're finishing on this one because I have a note here that says slow down. And I thought that's the one thing I want to talk about. And then Jordy brought it up again, and here we are. But I totally believe what you guys are saying. And, I think in the last episode, I talked a little bit about decision making in terms of how the human mind works I called it system 1 and system 2. So we have emotional, subjective decisions. That's how we make most of the decisions in our lives are made that way, especially in adventure when we're on the move, and they work most of the time. We're just making rapid decisions based on judgment and inputs that are coming at us quickly. But there's always, we can be biased and we can be wrong. And there's often errors in that kind of decision making. And that's where system 2 has to overcome that. And that's more logical. It might be math for some, or it might just be a really logical set of steps. That requires time. And so to your point here, I think if we find ourselves in situations where we're feeling a little overwhelmed, or we know there's a big decision to make, that's where you say, okay, this is not a decision to make quickly on emotion. This is time where I need to sit here and think about this for a minute. And I have 2 examples of that. I one time was skiing, helicopter skiing, landed on top of a big run. I'd been looking at this thing for ages, and I was ready to ski it. And we planned it. Everything was right. We got out on top of it, and I just still thought, you know what? I need some time. So I parked the group and I went and sat by myself for about five minutes, and took out my little yellow book, and I just wrote down all the pros and cons of what I was doing, which I already had thought them through, but just by simply writing them in my book for my eyes only, allowed me to process it with some time and go, okay, I'm doing the right thing. And I went back and we skied it. And another time I was coming down Athabasca in a whiteout, and I had to turn a corner, and there's a big crevasse on this corner, and I have to catch the ramp properly. Visibility was terrible. So I parked my group. I ran the rope out about 30 or 40 meters and sat by myself, and I just sat there. And we ended up sitting there for, I got them all dressed up. I sat there for probably 30 minutes, looking for visibility, waiting for the time, just thinking about it on my own. And so those are both examples of when I really attempted to let my rational mind take over and slow down and do calculated thinking, because the emotional fast thinking wasn't going to be the right way to do it at that point.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we're going to leave it off here. Grant, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been excellent.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I really enjoyed it as well. Great conversations.
Yeah, it's fun to geek out on risk with a group of risk geeks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to let Grant go here. If you would like to learn more about Grant and see some of his work, please check out our show notes. This is where we have posted links to his TED Talk, Instagram, and a couple of other resources that we recommend you check out. Well, Jordy, what were your takeaways from what Grant had to say about how to manage risk while leading adventure?
Well, Chris, this has been a super interesting set of discussions with Grant here. Tons of good information, things that I wish I had when I was first starting out in the adventure industry. One of my top takeaways was have a list of options. A good decision is one where we pick the best option. Identifying all of the options beforehand so that you hopefully have options is a crucial step toward making good decisions. Consider making lists so it is easy to see what your options are. The other one that really stands out for me is understanding intuition and how it plays out in our understanding and managing of risk. Generally, think of using intuition to try to reduce your risk and exposure. So not to increase it, but to decrease risk and exposure. If you think that you want to increase the risk in order to achieve a particular objective, you need to really be able to justify your decision to do so. And as Grant said, do so with hard facts. This avoids, hopefully, what we know is human error. And thirdly, avoiding overconfidence. Really beware the expert opinion, which is often wrong, but rarely in doubt. I'm guilty of that myself. We often think that we know more than we do, but we rarely want to admit that.
Those are all excellent points, Jordy, especially the one about overconfidence. I'm going to share 3 more that were key takeaways for me. First off, we can reduce our risk with knowledge. The more information we have, the easier it is to pick the best option. The challenge is that sometimes information can come at us very fast. And so the second takeaway for me is to slow down. Slowing down gives us more time to process the information coming at us so that we can identify the best option. When things come at us too quickly, we can miss important details. We can also default to familiar patterns instead of being open to trying new things or doing things a different way. Taking time and creating space can help us to be thorough and objective with our decision-making. The third point was to build ourselves a bigger buffer or a margin of error. Building a bigger buffer helps to protect us in case of a mistake, a miscalculation, or a surprise. Examples of building a bigger buffer include spending more time preparing, taking a more cautious route or line, giving ourselves more time to complete objectives, taking extra gear, or spending more time developing skills. On this last note, skill development helps us to become more efficient. Skill development also is an essential risk management strategy. The better we are at anything, the less prone we'll be to making mistakes, and the more agile we'll be at handling difficult situations. The purpose of this podcast is to bring in experts like Grant Statham so that our listeners can develop their adventure skills. Now, let's turn this over to you, the listener. Ask yourself, what were your takeaways? How do you manage risk when you are delivering adventure? If you have anything to add to this conversation, we would love to hear it. You can find all of our contact information in our show notes. And before we go, Jordy and I need your help. If you like this episode, please follow or subscribe to the show, and please recommend it to your social network. Growing a podcast audience from scratch is no easy task, and while we are watching our listener numbers grow steadily, we need to reach even more people so that we can keep bringing you great content. Jordy and I are just scratching the surface with the things that we want to explore on this show. Taking a moment to follow and share the show are 2 really important things that you can do to help us out. Thanks so much for listening.